Keanu Reeves navigated the Mustang through the winding roads of Los Angeles, the city lights flickering against the windshield as he drove. The weight of the day sat with him, not as a burden, but as something significant, something that marked a turning point. The dealership was no longer just a business. It had become a symbol of change, a reminder that small acts of fairness and decency could create ripples that reach far beyond a single showroom floor. Keanu Reeves stepped through the dealership doors, his presence unassuming. Dressed in a faded black t-shirt and a pair of well-worn jeans, he looked nothing like the Hollywood legend he was. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, and his expression held a quiet focus. But as he took in the rows of gleaming luxury cars, his gaze softened, landing on a classic A1969 Mustang, its cherry red paint glistening under the fluorescent lights. Keanu had been eyeing this very car for months. Cars had always been more than just vehicles to him. They were memories, pieces of his past, fragments of stories waiting to be rediscovered. This Mustang, in particular, meant more than anyone in that showroom could ever understand. The moment he stepped forward to examine it, the employees exchanged knowing looks. "Does this guy even know how much that costs?" one whispered to another, his smirk barely concealed. Another scoffed, "Maybe he thinks this is a rental shop." Keanu heard them, of course. He was no stranger to judgment, to whispers, to people making assumptions about him. He had spent years being underestimated, dismissed, and yet none of it ever ruffled him. Instead, he merely smiled, the corners of his lips barely lifting, and turned to the nearest salesman. "I'd like to ask about this Mustang," he said evenly. The salesman, a man in his mid-40s with slicked back hair and an expensive watch, barely hid his amusement. His tone was professional, but the condescension in his eyes was unmistakable. "Sorry, that's a collector's car. It's not exactly cheap," he said, as if trying to let Keanu down gently. Keanu simply nodded. "I understand." The salesman sighed, clearly unimpressed. "Well, unless you're serious about purchasing, I'm afraid we don't offer test drives to just anyone." The words lingered in the air. Just anyone. Keanu studied the man for a long moment, then glanced around at the others who had been watching him with barely contained amusement. He gave a small nod, turned on his heel, and walked out without another word. The second the glass doors shut behind him, laughter erupted inside the showroom. "Did he really think he could afford that?" one employee said between chuckles. "What a joke," another added, shaking his head. None of them realized that their laughter would be short-lived, because Keanu Reeves was not the kind of man to be underestimated. Outside, the city bustled with life, the sounds of honking cars and distant chatter filling the air. Keanu took a deep breath, letting the moment settle. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even surprised. He had encountered people like that before. People who judged others based on appearances. People who thought they could measure a person's worth by the cut of their clothes or the polish of their shoes. It didn't bother him, but it did remind him of something important. As he walked away from the dealership, he pulled out his phone and made a call. "Hey, it's me," he said when the person on the other end picked up. "I need a favor." The response came quickly, a tone of curiosity mixed with understanding. Keanu rarely called in favors. He wasn't the type. But when he did, it was always for something meaningful. That night, while the employees of the dealership enjoyed their usual routines, blissfully unaware of what was coming, Keanu was making arrangements. Not for revenge. He wasn't interested in proving anything to them. Instead, he saw something else. An opportunity. The next morning, the dealership opened as usual. The staff shuffled in, coffee cups in hand, ready for another day of selling to high-end clients. The laughter from the day before had long since faded into a distant memory. Another routine dismissal of someone they assumed was beneath them. Then, at precisely 10 o'clock, a convoy of sleek black SUVs pulled into the lot. The manager, a stout man with graying hair, frowned as he looked out the window. It wasn't unusual for wealthy clients to arrive in expensive cars, but there was something about this particular group that felt different. The SUVs parked smoothly in a row, and from the lead vehicle, a sharply dressed man in his 50s stepped out, briefcase in hand. He was followed by 3 more individuals, all exuding an air of importance. The glass doors swung open, and the group stepped inside, their polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. The laughter and idle chatter among the employees ceased immediately. There was a presence in the air, a quiet authority that made everyone stand a little straighter. "Good morning," the man with the briefcase said, his voice smooth and professional. "I'm here to speak with the owner of this dealership." The manager blinked, glancing toward the main office. I can get Mr. Langston for you. May I ask what this is about?" Before the suited man could respond, the glass doors opened again. This time, the room fell into stunned silence. Keanu Reeves walked in. Only he wasn't the casually dressed man from yesterday. Today, he wore a tailored navy blue suit, crisp and perfectly fitted. His hair was neatly styled, his presence carrying a quiet authority that demanded attention. Every employee who had mocked him the day before now stood frozen in place. The salesman with the slick-back hair paled visibly, his jaw slack. The manager swallowed hard. Reeves, welcome back." Keanu gave a polite nod, his expression unreadable. "I'm here to finalize some paperwork," he said, his voice calm. The suited man beside him stepped forward, flipping open his briefcase. "As of this morning, Mr. Reeves is the new majority shareholder of this dealership, effective immediately." A sharp intake of breath echoed through the room. Employees glanced at each other, their eyes wide, their minds scrambling to process what they had just heard. The salesman who had brushed Keanu off the day before took a step back, as if he could physically distance himself from the situation unfolding before him. I started, but no words followed. Keanu turned to him, his expression unreadable. "You said yesterday that test drives weren't offered to just anyone." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I assume that won't be an issue anymore." The room was so silent that the distant hum of the city outside felt deafening. The manager, whose face had gone in a natural shade of pale, cleared his throat. "Mr. Reeves, we sincerely apologize for any misunderstanding yesterday. Had we known—" "You didn't need to know," Keanu interrupted, his voice leveled. "That was the point." He glanced around the room, his gaze settling on each of the employees who had laughed at him, dismissed him. He wasn't here to humiliate them, nor was he interested in petty revenge. He had seen enough in life to know that proving someone wrong was never as satisfying as proving something right. With a small nod, he turned back to the man with the briefcase. "Let's get started." As the legal team moved into the office to begin the necessary paperwork, Keanu walked through the showroom, his gaze sweeping over the vehicles that lined the floor. His eyes landed once more on the Mustang, the car that had brought him here in the first place. A young woman, likely one of the newer sales associates, stood near the vehicle, shifting uncomfortably. She had been there yesterday, had witnessed everything, though she had not spoken. Now, she hesitated before finally stepping forward. "Reeves?" she said tentatively. Keanu turned, his expression softening just slightly. "Yes?" She swallowed. I just wanted to say that I'm sorry for the way they treated you. I should have said something." He studied her for a moment, then offered a small nod. "It's never easy to go against the current," he said, "but doing what's right is always worth it." She exhaled as if relieved and nodded. Keanu turned back to the Mustang. "I'll be taking this one," he said, almost to himself. The moment felt different now. It wasn't about proving a point. It wasn't about teaching a lesson. It was about something bigger, something deeper. For the first time since stepping into the dealership, Keanu allowed himself to smile. It was a quiet smile, one filled with the kind of understanding that only someone who had experienced both loss and redemption could carry. And as he stepped forward, running his hand over the Mustang's polished surface, he knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. Keanu stood by the Mustang, his fingers lightly brushing over the smooth metal. It was more than just a car. It was a connection to something that mattered, something beyond wealth, fame, or even legacy. The dealership employees still hovered in silence, their earlier smugness replaced by unease. He wasn't here for revenge, but he had given them something to think about. As the paperwork was finalized inside the office, Keanu took a moment to walk the showroom floor, taking in the different vehicles, the sales displays, the way everything was designed to exude luxury. But to him, something was missing. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. Mr. Reeves. He turned to see a woman standing near one of the cars. She was dressed in the standard dealership uniform, her dark hair neatly pulled back into a ponytail. She looked nervous, as if she had debated speaking to him for some time. Yes, Keanu replied gently. I just wanted to say I think what you're doing is really amazing, she said. Not just buying the car or the dealership, but the way you're handling this. He studied her for a moment. What do you mean? She hesitated before glancing toward the office where the manager and legal team were still in discussion. Then she lowered her voice. This place, it's not as great as it looks from the outside, she admitted. It's been struggling for months. Sales are down, and most of the employees you saw yesterday, they act that way to everyone. They assume if you don't show up in a designer suit, you're not worth their time. Keanu nodded, unsurprised. And what about you? Her expression shifted. I try to treat people differently, but I'm just one person. When I saw what happened yesterday, I knew it wasn't right, but I was too afraid to speak up. I guess I was worried about losing my job. Keanu gave her a reassuring look. Speaking up is never easy, but it matters. She seemed to take comfort in his words, and for the first time since their conversation started, she smiled. Can I ask you something? She said hesitantly. Of course. Did you come back? Keanu considered her question carefully, because sometimes the best way to change something is to become part of it, he said. And sometimes people need to be reminded that kindness should come before judgment. Her smile widened, and for the first time that morning, Keanu felt the tension in the air begin to lift. The office door swung open, and the suited man from earlier approached. Everything is settled, he informed Keanu. As of now, you own a controlling interest in this dealership. Congratulations. A murmur rippled through the employees. The news had become official, and now there was no denying it. Keanu Reeves was their new boss. The manager, looking increasingly pale, stepped forward with a forced smile. Mr. Reeves, I just want to say on behalf of everyone here, we're thrilled to have you. Keanu looked at him for a long moment before replying. Are you? The man's smile faltered slightly. Of course, he said quickly. And I want to assure you that we'll make sure this dealership is up to the highest standards. Will be, Keanu interrupted, but not by doing things the same way. The manager blinked. Sir? Keanu glanced around at the employees, then spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. I don't believe in leading from behind a desk. So starting today, we're changing the way we do things here. No more assumptions about customers based on what they wear. No more dismissing people before they even have a chance to speak. And no more forgetting that respect should be the foundation of this business. The room was silent, but the weight of his words settled over everyone. Some looked uncomfortable, others contemplative. Keanu turned back to the manager. You've been here for a long time, haven't you? Yes, sir, the man said, nodding eagerly. I've been running this dealership for over a decade. Keanu studied him, then made a decision. Then you know how this business operates better than most. The manager's chest puffed up slightly. That's correct. Good, Keanu said. Then you also know when it's time to step down. The room collectively held its breath. The manager's expression went from proud to panicked in a matter of seconds. Sir, Keanu shook his head. I need leadership that reflects the new direction of this dealership. Your time here has come to an end. There is no anger in his voice, no theatrics, just a calm certainty. The manager opened his mouth as if to argue, but then closed it again, realizing there was no room for negotiation. His dismissal was final. Keanu turned back to the woman he had spoken to earlier, the only employee who had shown any genuine kindness. What's your name? He asked. Her eyes widened slightly. Jessica? Keanu nodded. Jessica, I'd like you to step into a leadership role here. She took a step back. Me? You said you wanted to make a difference, but didn't feel like you had the power to do so, Keanu said. Well, now you do. Jessica glanced around, clearly shocked. The other employees watched in stunned silence, some exchanging whispers. I don't know what to say, she admitted. Say yes, Keanu said simply. Because people like you are the ones who can help create real change. Jessica took a deep breath, then nodded. Yes. Keanu smiled. Good. With that, he turned back to the rest of the employees. For those of you who are willing to embrace a new way of doing things, you're welcome to stay. But if you think respect, kindness, and fairness don't belong in this business, then you're free to walk away. The employees looked at each other, some shifting uncomfortably. It was clear that change had arrived, whether they were ready for it or not. Keanu stepped back toward the Mustang, running his hand over its hood one last time before pulling the keys from his pocket. He had come here for a car, but he was leaving with something far more important, a chance to change something for the better. As he slid into the driver's seat, the engine rumbled to life beneath him. He could feel the weight of the moment settling around him, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a new beginning. He took one last glance at the dealership before pulling out of the lot, the Mustang's tires rolling smoothly onto the road. Behind him, the dealership was no longer the same place it had been when he first walked in, and neither was he. The Mustang's engine purred as Keanu steered it onto the open road, the hum of the city slowly fading behind him. The events of the morning played in his mind, but he wasn't one to dwell. Change had been set in motion, and that was enough. The wind rushing through the open windows carried with it a sense of renewal, as if the universe itself had acknowledged the shift. His hands tightened on the wheel. He had bought the dealership not to prove a point, but because he saw an opportunity to reshape something, to remind people of what really mattered. But that was only one part of the journey. Keanu wasn't heading home, he had somewhere else to be. The Mustang moved effortlessly through the winding roads leading toward a quieter part of town. It wasn't a place people often associated with Hollywood, but for him, it was a space untouched by the rush of the industry, a retreat from the world when things felt too loud. He arrived at a small, family-run garage tucked between towering buildings, its faded sign reading, McLaren Auto Repairs. It wasn't flashy, but it had history. Keanu had come here for years, long before he was a household name. The owner, Tom McLaren, was a legend in his own right, a man who could rebuild an engine with his eyes closed, but preferred to work in silence, away from the chaos of corporate-run mechanics. The bell above the door jingled as Keanu stepped inside, greeted by the scent of motor oil and freshly welded steel. Well, I'll be damned. Tom stepped out from behind a cluttered workbench, wiping grease from his hands. His weathered face broke into a grin. He was in his 60s now, but age hadn't slowed him down. Keanu smiled. Miss me? Tom chuckled, tossing the rag onto a stool. I knew you'd be back eventually. You never could resist a classic Mustang. He stepped forward, running a hand along the car's hood. 69 model. You got good taste, kid. Keanu leaned against the counter, watching as Tom inspected the vehicle. It's more than just a car, he said quietly. Tom didn't press. He never did. That was one of the reasons Keanu trusted him. The old mechanic gave a knowing nod. You want me to take a look under the hood? Keanu hesitated before shaking his head. Not today, but I do need your advice on something. Tom raised an eyebrow. That dealership you bought? Keanu smirked. News travels fast. Tom scoffed. Of course it does. The second some Hollywood bigshot buys up a failing business, everyone's got an opinion. He paused, studying Keanu carefully. But I doubt you did it just for the headlines. Keanu sighed, crossing his arms. They wrote people off the second they walked through the door. If you weren't wearing a suit, you didn't matter to them. I wanted to change that. Tom nodded approvingly. That's a hell of a reason. But now, I have to make sure it actually works, Keanu admitted. A dealership is more than just selling cars. It's about trust, reputation. I want to build something that lasts. Tom tapped his fingers against the Mustang's hood, considering his words. Then you need the right people in charge. You got someone in mind? Keanu thought of Jessica, the young woman at the dealership who had been afraid to speak up but had understood what needed to change. Yeah, he said. I think I do. Tom grunted in approval. Then that's your start. But you know it's going to take more than one good hire, right? Keanu nodded. That's why I need people I can trust. People who know what real customer service looks like. Tom leaned against the counter, rubbing his chin. I might have someone for you. My nephew Aaron, he's been working at a different dealership for years, but the higher-ups treat him like a number. He's been looking for something better. Keanu's interest peaked. You trust him? Tom nodded firmly. He's a good kid. Knows his cars, treats people right. He's the kind of guy who'd give you an honest answer, not just try to sell you the most expensive model on the lot. Keanu considered it for a moment before nodding. Tell him to come by tomorrow. Tom grinned. I'll make sure he does. As they shook hands, Keanu felt something settle in his chest. An assurance that he was on the right path. By the time he left the garage, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the city. He drove in silence for a while, letting the hum of the engine fill the space. He wasn't heading home just yet. Instead, he took a detour toward a quiet neighborhood, pulling up in front of a modest house with a well-kept garden. He stepped out of the Mustang, running a hand through his hair before making his way to the front porch. The door opened before he could knock. Keanu? A woman in her 60s stood there, her eyes widening in surprise before a warm smile spread across her face. Hi, Marie, he said softly. Marie was Jennifer's mother. She stepped forward, embracing him without hesitation. It's been a while, she murmured. Keanu nodded. Yeah, too long. She ushered him inside, leading him to the cozy living room where the walls were still adorned with photos of Jennifer. Pictures from her childhood, her college years, candid moments captured with love. Marie studied him carefully. You found it, didn't you? Keanu's throat tightened. He didn't have to ask what she meant. The Mustang, he confirmed. I finally bought it. Tears welled in Marie's eyes, but she smiled. She would have been so happy. Keanu swallowed hard. I wanted to tell you in person, and I wanted to check in on you. Marie reached out, squeezing his hand. I'm doing okay, Keanu. I miss her every day, but I know she wouldn't want us to be stuck in the past. He nodded slowly. I think I'm finally starting to understand that. Marie gave him a knowing look. And what about you? Are you finding your way? Keanu exhaled, glancing down at the floor before looking back up. I think I'm trying to build something meaningful, something Jennifer would have been proud of. Marie smiled, her eyes filled with warmth. She was always proud of you, Keanu, no matter what. They sat together for a while, reminiscing, sharing memories, letting the weight of the past exist between them without sorrow overshadowing it. By the time Keanu left, the stars had begun to scatter across the night sky. He sat in the Mustang for a moment, gripping the wheel as he took in the moment. The past would always be a part of him, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't letting it define him. With a quiet breath, he turned the key in the ignition, the Mustang roaring to life once more. And with that, he drove forward. Towards something new, something real, something that had yet to be written. Keanu's hands rested lightly on the Mustang's wheel as the city lights blurred past him. He wasn't in a rush. The road stretched ahead like a quiet promise, offering nothing but possibility. It had been a long day, filled with decisions that would shape the future of the dealership, the people working there, and maybe even himself. But there was still something unfinished. As he drove, his mind wandered back to Jessica, the young woman at the dealership. He had seen the look in her eyes when he told her he wanted her in a leadership role. It was a mixture of surprise, gratitude, and something else, uncertainty. She wasn't sure she could do it. Keanu knew that feeling all too well. There had been times in his life when doubt had crept in, whispering that he wasn't enough, that he didn't belong. It was a battle he had learned to fight with quiet persistence, proving to himself over and over again that he was capable. Now, he needed to make sure Jessica found that same strength within herself. The next morning, Keanu pulled into the dealership's lot before anyone else arrived. The air was crisp, the early sunlight casting long shadows across the pavement. He stepped out of the Mustang and leaned against the hood, waiting. Jessica arrived a few minutes later, a cup of coffee in one hand and a look of quiet determination on her face. She hesitated when she saw him, then walked over. "Morning," she said cautiously. "Morning," Keanu replied. "Figured I'd get here early." Jessica sipped her coffee, glancing at the dealership. "Feels different already." Keanu nodded. "Change starts small." She looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you really think I can do this?" He met her gaze. "I wouldn't have asked if I didn't." Jessica exhaled slowly. "I don't want to let you down." "Swung?" She considered his words before nodding. "Okay." It wasn't an instant transformation, but Keanu knew that confidence wasn't something handed to you, it was something you built, piece by piece. Jessica had taken the first step. By the time the rest of the employees arrived, Keanu was inside, reviewing the dealership structure. He had already reached out to Tom's nephew, Aaron, who was scheduled for an interview later that afternoon. If things went well, Aaron would be one of the first hires under the dealership's new direction. As Keanu walked the floor, he noticed the shift in energy. The employees who had once smirked at him now moved with a new awareness. Some still seemed uncomfortable, unsure of what his presence meant for their future. Others, like Jessica, were already adapting, finding their footing in a dealership that was no longer driven by arrogance. Midway through the morning, an older man entered the showroom. He was dressed in a faded plaid jacket, his hands weathered from years of labor. He didn't fit the usual profile of customers who walk through these doors, and Keanu saw the way some employees hesitated, unsure of how to approach him. Keanu stepped forward. "Go cool. Good morning," he greeted. "Can I help you find something?" The man looked up, surprised. "Oh, I was just looking. My grandson's been dreaming about getting his first car, and I thought I'd check out some options." Keanu smiled. "That's a big moment. Do you have something specific in mind?" The man rubbed the back of his neck. "Well, nothing too fancy, something reliable, safe, but I'm not sure if a place like this would have anything in my price range." Keanu glanced around, then motioned for Jessica to join them. "Jessica, can you help find something that fits what he's looking for?" Jessica nodded. "Of course." She turned to the man. "Why don't we start over here?" As she led him toward a row of affordable, well-maintained vehicles, Keanu watched as she fell into her new role naturally. She asked the right questions, listened to the customer's concerns, and for the first time, he saw her stand a little taller. Later that afternoon, Aaron arrived. He was in his early 30s, with an easy confidence that didn't tip into arrogance. His handshake was firm and his eyes were sharp with understanding. "Tom speaks highly of you," Keanu said as they sat in one of the dealership's offices. Aaron chuckled. "He does? That's rare." Keanu smirked. He said, "You know cars and you treat people right. That's exactly what I need here." Aaron nodded. "I've been in this business long enough to know that it's not just about selling cars. It's about trust. Customers come in with their own stories, their own reasons for buying a car. Some are excited, some are nervous, and some have been burned before. The job isn't just selling, it's making sure they leave feeling like they made the right decision." Keanu leaned back in his chair. "That's the kind of thinking I want leading this dealership." Aaron considered his words before nodding. "Then I'm in." Keanu extended his hand. "Welcome aboard." With Aaron on the team and Jessica stepping into her role, the dealership had its foundation. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, Keanu could see the pieces falling into place. Over the next few weeks, changes rippled through the dealership. Employees who weren't willing to adapt quietly left. Those who stayed found themselves adjusting to a workplace that now prioritized respect over status. Customers noticed the difference too. Word spread that the dealership had new leadership, that it was no longer a place where appearances determined how you were treated. Then, one afternoon, a familiar face walked through the doors. The salesman who had dismissed Keanu on that first day, the one who had sneered and laughed as he walked out, stood hesitantly in the showroom. He looked different now. There was no smugness, no condescension, only uncertainty. Jessica approached him first. "Can I help you?" He hesitated before shaking his head. I was hoping to speak with Mr. Reeves." Keanu, who had been reviewing inventory near the back, looked up. Their eyes met across the showroom, and the salesman swallowed hard. Keanu walked over, hands in his pockets. "You looking for a car?" The salesman shook his head. "No, sir, he exhaled. "I wanted to apologize." Keanu studied him. He could tell the words weren't easy for the man to say. The salesman cleared his throat. "I misjudged you. That day, I let my own assumptions get in the way of treating you with the respect every customer deserves, and I know now that I was wrong." Keanu nodded. "Takes a lot to admit that." The salesman nodded, shifting uncomfortably. Heard about the changes you've made here. It's not the same place it was before." He hesitated. "I was hoping maybe there's room for me to earn back a place here." Keanu considered him for a long moment. He didn't believe in holding grudges. People could change if they truly wanted to. "You're not the same person who laughed at me that day," Keanu finally said. The salesman shook his head. "No, sir, I'm not." Keanu extended his hand. "Then let's see what you can do." The salesman's eyes widened, surprised by the offer. But as he shook Keanu's hand, there was something genuine in his expression. Relief, gratitude, and perhaps redemption. As the weeks turned into months, the dealership flourished. It became more than just a business. It became a place where people were treated with fairness, where customers were seen and heard. And at the center of it all, Keanu remained the same. He had never set out to be a businessman, but in building something meaningful, he had found a new purpose. And as he stepped into the Mustang one evening, staring out at the city skyline, he knew that sometimes the most unexpected turns led to the most important destinations. Like what you saw, there's another video on screen you'll love. Don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories